I found out my wife was cheating because a stranger congratulated me on my promotion that I never got. And that moment was the first tiny crack in a reality I thought was solid. I'm posting here because I honestly don't know if I'm looking for advice, validation, or just somewhere to pour this out before it eats me alive. My name's Michael. I'm 38. And until 2 weeks ago, I believed my marriage was stable in that quiet, ordinary way where nothing dramatic happens and you assume that means everything is fine. My wife, Lauren, and I had been together for 11 years, married for 8, and we had built what looked like a normal life from the outside. We had a small house, predictable routines, and the kind of comfortable silence that comes from years of shared history. But somewhere in the past few months, something had shifted in ways I could not explain. Small things that seemed harmless at first, like the way she began turning her phone face down whenever I walked into a room, or how she suddenly developed late team dinners that always seemed to run past midnight. I remember asking her about it one night while she was putting on makeup before leaving and saying carefully, "Lauren, you've been out a lot lately and I'm starting to feel like I'm missing something." And she laughed in that dismissive way she sometimes used when she thought I was being unreasonable and replied, "Michael, not everything is a conspiracy. Some of us actually have careers that require socializing." The strange thing is that I wanted to believe her so badly that I ignored the knot forming in my chest, because trust is something you defend even when the evidence starts whispering that you shouldn't. The moment that changed everything happened 3 days later when I stopped by her office building to bring her lunch, which was something I did occasionally because I thought it was a small gesture that reminded her someone cared about her exhausting schedule. As I stepped into the lobby, a man I had never seen before smiled at me with this knowing expression and said, "Hey man, congratulations on the promotion. Your wife told us you finally made partner." The problem with that sentence was simple and devastating at the same time. Because I had not been promoted. I had not even applied for a promotion, and in that instant I realized Lauren had been telling people a completely different story about my life than the one I was actually living. I forced a polite smile and asked him calmly what he meant, and he shrugged like it was obvious and replied, "She said once you move into the executive level, you guys are finally upgrading to a penthouse downtown." I remember standing there holding a bag of takeout that suddenly felt absurdly heavy, while a thought crept slowly into my mind. The kind of thought that feels like stepping onto thin ice. If my wife was lying about me to strangers, then the question that followed was terrifyingly simple, because I could not stop asking myself who exactly she was trying to impress with those lies. I wish I could say that I confronted Lauren immediately, that I stormed upstairs to her office and demanded answers like people do in movies. But the truth is far less dramatic and far more unsettling because suspicion rarely explodes all at once. Instead, it grows quietly in the background like mold in the walls of a house you thought was safe. I stood there in that lobby for another minute after the stranger walked away, staring at my phone and debating whether I should call her or simply leave. And in the end, I decided to go upstairs because a part of me was still desperate to believe there was some harmless explanation waiting for me. When I reached her floor, I could see through the glass conference room walls that she was in a meeting, laughing with 3 co-workers, her body language confident and relaxed in a way I had not seen at home for weeks. I sat in the waiting area with the takeout bag on my lap, trying to slow my breathing, when 2 women from her department walked past me, and one of them glanced over and said quietly to the other, "That must be him," which was strange enough to make my stomach tighten. The second woman lowered her voice, but not enough, and I heard her whisper back, "Yeah, the husband she says can't keep up with her lifestyle." That sentence landed like a hammer, and suddenly all those small moments from the past few months started rearranging themselves in my memory like puzzle pieces forming a picture I didn't want to see. I remembered the night she mocked my car for being too modest, the way she joked at dinner with friends that she felt like she had married someone comfortable with mediocrity, and the countless times she compared me to men in her office who apparently lived in a completely different financial universe. I had always brushed those comments off as sarcasm, but sitting there in that hallway, I started realizing they might not have been jokes at all. When the meeting ended, Lauren walked out with her coworkers and froze, when she saw me sitting there holding the bag of food, and for a brief moment, something flickered across her face that looked dangerously close to panic before it disappeared behind a bright, practiced smile. She walked toward me and said loudly, almost theatrically, "Michael, what are you doing here? You didn't tell me you were coming." And I replied calmly, "I thought I'd surprise you with lunch, but apparently surprises are happening all over the place today." Her co-workers lingered nearby, pretending to check their phones, and Lauren grabbed my arm with a tight grip that felt less affectionate than controlling as she pulled me into an empty conference room and shut the door behind us. The smile vanished immediately, and her voice dropped into something sharp and irritated as she said, "You cannot just show up here unannounced like this. Do you understand how embarrassing that is for me?" I stared at her for a long moment before answering slowly, "I think the embarrassing part might be the story you've been telling people about me getting a promotion that doesn't exist." For the first time since I had known her, Lauren didn't respond immediately, and the silence stretched long enough that I could feel something fragile in our marriage beginning to crack. Then she exhaled dramatically and rolled her eyes like I was a child making a scene and said, "Michael, I told them that because it makes me look better socially. You wouldn't understand how competitive things are here." The casual cruelty of that explanation stunned me. But what I didn't know yet was that the lie about my promotion was the smallest deception in a web that was about to unravel in ways I could never have imagined. I left her office that day feeling like the ground under my life had shifted slightly, but not completely collapsed yet, which in hindsight was the cruelest stage of the whole thing because it gave me just enough hope to believe things might still make sense. On the drive home, I kept replaying that conversation in my head, trying to convince myself that Lauren's explanation, as arrogant and dismissive as it sounded, might still be the truth. She had always been ambitious, sometimes brutally so, and I tried to frame the lie about my promotion as another one of those shallow social games people play in corporate environments. But the problem with lies is that once you notice one, your mind starts looking for others. That night, Lauren came home late again, dropped her purse on the kitchen counter, and said with exaggerated exhaustion, "You would not believe the kind of people I have to deal with all day just to keep my career moving forward," as if the whole world existed purely to inconvenience her. I watched her pour a glass of wine and asked quietly, "Lauren, why are people at your office talking about our finances like they know more about them than I do?" She took a slow sip, looked at me with mild irritation, and replied, "Because I present us as successful, Michael. That's how networking works. You wouldn't understand because you're comfortable staying exactly where you are." I might have continued arguing with her if something strange had not happened the next morning. I was leaving for work when my phone buzzed with a notification from our joint bank account, something I usually ignored because Lauren handled most of the day-to-day spending. But this one caught my attention immediately because the amount was enormous. A transfer of nearly $15,000 sent the previous night to an account I had never seen before. I stared at the screen for a long moment before walking back inside and asking her directly, "Lauren, why did you move $15,000 out of our account at midnight?" She barely looked up from her phone and said in a tone dripping with annoyance, "Relax, it's an investment opportunity through someone at work. You're always so paranoid about money." Something about the way she said, "someone at work," made my stomach twist, and before I could stop myself, I asked, "Which coworker exactly convinced you to move that much money without telling me?" She laughed coldly and replied, "Michael, you really need to stop acting like I require your permission to manage our finances." For the next few days, the tension between us hung in the air like a storm that refused to break, and I started noticing things I had ignored before. Her phone was suddenly locked with a password she had never used before. She took calls in another room, and once I caught her smiling at a message before quickly turning the screen away from me. The moment that pushed me from suspicion into certainty happened on Friday evening when I was doing laundry, and her work jacket slipped off a hanger onto the floor. As I picked it up, something small fell from the pocket and slid across the tile, a hotel keycard from a place downtown that neither of us had ever stayed at. I stood there staring at that thin piece of plastic for a long time, while my heart pounded harder than it had in years. When Lauren came home later that night, I held the keycard up between two fingers and asked slowly, "Do you want to explain why this was in your pocket?" She froze in the doorway, and instead of looking guilty, she looked irritated, like I had just interrupted something more important than our marriage. Then she shrugged and said casually, "It was from a networking event, Michael. You really need to stop inventing drama." What I didn't know at that moment was that the hotel card was not evidence of a single lie. It was the door to a secret life that involved far more people than I was prepared to discover. And the next revelation would show me that someone I trusted had been standing inside that secret with her the entire time. The hotel keycard sat on the kitchen table between us like a silent accusation. And the strange thing was that Lauren did not even try to look worried. Instead, she leaned against the counter, crossed her arms, and gave me the same expression she used when she thought I was being unreasonable. "You are exhausting sometimes," she said with a slow shake of her head. It was a work mixer. People booked rooms for presentations. Someone handed me the card to hold while they were grabbing drinks. The explanation sounded thin even as she said it, but what unsettled me more was the absolute confidence with which she delivered it, as if she had already rehearsed that story and believed I would swallow it without question. I remember staring at her and asking quietly, "Lauren, do you realize how ridiculous that sounds?" She scoffed and replied, "Do you realize how insecure you sound right now, Michael? Because honestly, it's embarrassing." For a moment the room fell silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, and I felt something inside me shift from confusion into something colder and more focused. That night I couldn't sleep, and sometime around 2 a.m. I got out of bed, walked into the living room, and sat there staring at my phone while the doubts kept circling in my head. Part of me still wanted to believe her because the alternative meant admitting that the person I had trusted for over a decade might be living a completely different life behind my back. But another part of me kept replaying that stranger in the lobby congratulating me on a promotion that never happened, the whispers from her coworkers, the unexplained money transfer, and now a hotel keycard that magically appeared in her pocket. Around 3 a.m, I did something I had never done before in our entire relationship. I opened our shared phone account and looked at the call history connected to Lauren's number. At first, everything looked normal, the usual mix of work contacts and friends, but then one number appeared over and over again. Dozens of calls scattered across late nights and early mornings when she supposedly had been asleep beside me. I copied the number into a search bar, expecting it to belong to one of her colleagues, maybe the person involved in that mysterious investment opportunity. But the name that appeared on the screen made my stomach drop so hard, it felt like the air had left my lungs. The number belonged to Daniel Harris, my best friend since college, the man who had stood beside me at our wedding and toasted our marriage in front of everyone we loved. I sat there staring at his contact information for a long time, hoping there had to be some mistake, because Daniel had been in our house countless times, sharing dinners, watching games with me on weekends, laughing with Lauren like he was family. But when I looked back at the call log, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Dozens of conversations lasting 20 minutes, sometimes 40, always happening at hours when she claimed she was busy with work. My hands were shaking when I whispered to the empty room, "No, that's not possible." But the evidence sat there on the screen refusing to disappear. The next morning I tried to act normal when Lauren woke up, but the knowledge had already begun poisoning every word between us. When she kissed me on the cheek before leaving for work, I felt my stomach twist because all I could think about was the possibility that she had been talking to my best friend behind my back for months. As the front door closed behind her, I looked down at my phone again and realized something else that made the situation even darker. The last call between them had happened just 2 hours earlier while she was lying in bed next to me pretending to sleep. And in that moment, a terrible thought crept into my mind that made my heart pound with a mixture of dread and anger. Because if Lauren and Daniel had been talking that late at night, then the next question was brutally simple. If they were speaking that often in secret, what exactly had they been doing when I wasn't around? I didn't confront Daniel right away. And looking back, that decision probably saved me from exploding too early before I understood how deep the betrayal really went. Instead, I spent the next 2 days pretending everything was normal while quietly watching Lauren with a level of attention I had never paid before. It was disturbing how quickly the pattern started appearing once I knew where to look. She stepped outside to take calls she claimed were from coworkers. She kept her phone face down even when she walked into the bathroom. And one night I caught her smiling at a message before she noticed me in the doorway and locked the screen so quickly it looked almost mechanical. The worst part was how natural she acted around me. How easily she played the role of my wife while carrying on a secret conversation with the one person I trusted more than anyone else. On Wednesday evening, Daniel texted me asking if I wanted to grab a drink like we sometimes did after work. And reading that message felt like someone had poured ice water straight into my chest. I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying, "Sure, same place at 7. Because a part of me needed to look him in the eye before deciding whether I was about to lose both my marriage and my best friend in the same week. The bar we usually met at was quiet that night, the kind of place where conversations disappear into low music and dim lighting, and Daniel greeted me with the same easy grin he had worn for 20 years, as if nothing in the world had changed. He clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Man, you look like you've had a rough week," which almost made me laugh because the understatement was almost cruel. We ordered drinks and talked about work for a few minutes before the silence between us grew too heavy to ignore. And finally I leaned back in my chair and said calmly, "Daniel, I want to ask you something and I need you to be honest with me." He nodded slowly and replied, "Of course. What's going on?" I took out my phone, opened the call history, and turned the screen toward him so he could see his own number appearing again and again under Lauren's contact. The moment his eyes landed on the screen, something changed in his face so quickly it felt like watching a mask fall off. He looked down at the table, rubbed the back of his neck, and whispered, "Michael, I can explain." That sentence was the moment my worst fear stopped being a suspicion and became a reality sitting across from me in a dimly lit bar. I asked him quietly, "How long?" And for a long time, he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded tired, almost resigned, as if he had been waiting for this confrontation to happen eventually. "About 5 months," he said, and the room seemed to tilt slightly as those words settled in my mind. 5 months meant dozens of dinners together, weekends where he came over to watch games, nights where Lauren kissed me goodnight while secretly talking to him behind my back. I clenched my hands around the edge of the table and asked the question I'd been dreading since I saw his number on the call log. "Were you sleeping with my wife?" Daniel closed his eyes for a moment before answering in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "Yes." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke, and the silence between us felt like a crater where 20 years of friendship used to exist. Then he said something that made the situation spiral into something far worse than a simple affair. He leaned forward, lowered his voice, and said, "Michael, you need to understand something because Lauren didn't start this the way you think." I stared at him with a mixture of rage and disbelief as he continued carefully, choosing every word like he was walking through a minefield. "She told me you two were basically done months ago, that you were emotionally checked out and planning to leave her once your finances stabilized. And in that moment, another terrible realization hit me with the force of a second betrayal. Because if Lauren had been telling Daniel that story, then it meant she hadn't just been cheating. She had been rewriting our entire marriage to justify it. When Daniel said that Lauren told him our marriage was already falling apart, something inside me went completely still, in a way that scared me more than anger would have. I leaned back in my chair, looked at him for a long moment, and said slowly, "So she told you I was planning to leave her?" Daniel nodded cautiously and replied, "She said you had been distant for months, that you barely talked anymore, and that you were only staying until you sorted out money and the house." I couldn't help letting out a hollow laugh because the version of me she had described sounded like a stranger wearing my face. "Daniel," I said quietly, "I have never said anything even close to that." He looked genuinely shaken when I said it, as if a piece of the story he believed had suddenly cracked. "She told me you were emotionally gone," he said, almost defensively. "She said the marriage was basically over and that you just hadn't made it official yet." Hearing that twisted narrative made my stomach churn because it meant Lauren had been laying the groundwork for this long before I discovered anything. For a few minutes, Daniel kept talking, almost like a confession he had been holding in for too long. He explained how Lauren started messaging him late at night, complaining about how unfulfilled she felt and how she deserved a more exciting life than the one we were living. According to him, she painted me as a man who lacked ambition, someone holding her back from the lifestyle she believed she deserved. "She said you didn't understand her goals," he added carefully, "that you were comfortable staying average while she wanted something bigger." Listening to him repeat those things felt surreal because they were echoes of the exact insults she had been throwing at me recently. But then Daniel said something that made my blood run cold. He rubbed his face nervously and admitted, "At first I thought she just needed someone to talk to, but then she started telling me things about you, personal things, things that made it sound like you didn't even care about her anymore." I stared at him and asked in a low voice, "What kind of things?" Daniel hesitated before answering, clearly uncomfortable. "She told me you barely touched her anymore and that you treated her like a roommate." That accusation felt like a slap because it wasn't just a lie. It was the exact opposite of reality. Lauren had been the one pulling away for months, turning away in bed, brushing off my attempts to talk about what was wrong between us. I told Daniel that, and the confusion on his face deepened with every word. It was as if the story he had believed for months was unraveling right in front of him. Finally, he sighed and said, "Michael, I swear I didn't know the truth. If I had known you two were still actually together like that, I never would have crossed that line." I wanted to believe him, but the anger inside me was still too raw to accept that explanation easily. I asked him one more question, the one that had been sitting in the back of my mind since the moment I discovered his number in Lauren's call log. "Did she ever talk about the money?" I asked quietly. Daniel frowned slightly and said, "What money?" I told him about the $15,000 transfer from our joint account, and the confusion on his face turned into something closer to alarm. "Michael," he said slowly, "Lauren told me you had already separated your finances and that the money she was using was hers." My chest tightened as another piece of the puzzle slid into place, because suddenly the lies were multiplying faster than I could track them. I whispered, "We never separated anything, Daniel. That was our shared savings." He sat there staring at the table for a moment before looking back at me with a troubled expression and saying something that made the entire situation spiral into an even darker direction. "Michael, she told me something else too," he said carefully. "Something I didn't question at the time, but now it sounds wrong." I felt my pulse quicken as I asked him what he meant. Daniel took a slow breath and replied, "Lauren said that once she moved into that penthouse she kept talking about, you wouldn't be living there with her." And in that moment I realized the affair wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It sounded like she had already been planning a future that didn't include me at all. When Daniel told me Lauren had been talking about a future where I wasn't even part of the picture, the anger I had been holding back finally started turning into something colder and far more dangerous than rage. I leaned forward and asked him slowly, "Daniel, I need you to think very carefully about this, because if she was planning to move into a penthouse without me, then she must have told you where that money was supposed to come from." He hesitated for a moment before nodding, and the look on his face made it clear he was beginning to realize just how twisted the situation had become. "She said it was all part of a bigger plan," he admitted quietly. "She told me you were about to come into a lot of money from some investment you made years ago, and once that happened, she was finally going to leave you." My stomach tightened as those words sank in because I had never mentioned any investment like that to anyone, not even Lauren. I stared at him and asked, "Did she tell you what kind of investment?" Daniel swallowed and replied, "She said it was something connected to your family." The moment he said that, a memory surfaced so suddenly it felt like someone had flipped a switch in my mind. 2 months earlier, my uncle passed away and left me a modest inheritance, something I had barely discussed with anyone because I was still sorting through the legal details with a lawyer. I had mentioned it to Lauren once in passing, but I had never told her how much it was worth because I didn't even know the final number yet. I looked back at Daniel and said carefully, "Did she tell you how much money she thought I was getting?" He nodded slowly and answered, "She told me it was close to $1 million. Hearing that number made my chest tighten with disbelief because it was not even remotely accurate. My uncle's estate was nowhere near that large, but somehow Lauren had convinced herself that a fortune was about to land in our lives. Daniel continued explaining, almost apologetically. She said once the money came in, you'd move it into your account, and then she would file for divorce so she could take half. For a moment, I just sat there staring at the table while the full scope of the situation unfolded in my mind, like a nightmare that kept getting worse every time you thought it had reached the bottom. Lauren had not just been cheating on me. She had been preparing a financial ambush based on money that didn't even exist. She had told Daniel that our marriage was already dead, convinced him I was leaving her anyway, and then planned to walk away with half of an inheritance she imagined was coming soon. I looked up at him and asked quietly, "Daniel, did she ever say when she planned to do all this?" He nodded again, his voice tense now. "She said she was waiting until the inheritance was finalized and the money showed up in your account." I exhaled slowly because the cruel irony of the situation was almost unbelievable. Lauren was planning to destroy our marriage for money she thought I was hiding from her, while the truth was far more complicated. Then Daniel said something else that made the entire story twist in a way I never expected. He leaned closer across the table and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Michael, there's something you need to know because I think you're misunderstanding one part of this." I frowned slightly and asked what he meant. Daniel looked genuinely uneasy before saying, "Lauren wasn't planning to leave you alone. She was planning to leave you for someone else." When Daniel said that Lauren was planning to leave me for someone else, I expected him to say his own name, and for a split second the room seemed to freeze because I thought the last piece of the betrayal was about to fall into place. But instead he shook his head slowly, as if he already knew what I was thinking, and said something that made the entire situation twist in a way I could never have predicted. "It wasn't me," he said quietly. "She told me I was temporary." The words felt surreal, like hearing the ending of a story that kept rewriting itself. I stared at him in disbelief and asked, "Temporary for what exactly?" Daniel hesitated, then leaned closer across the table and spoke in a voice heavy with regret. "Lauren said there was someone at her office who could give her the life she actually wanted, someone with real money and connections. She told me once the divorce happened and the inheritance was split, she would move into the penthouse with him." For a moment, the noise of the bar faded into the background because the realization hit me with brutal clarity. Lauren had not just been cheating, she had been running a layered manipulation that involved lies stacked on top of lies. She had convinced Daniel that our marriage was already dying so he would become an emotional escape, while at the same time chasing someone else entirely who represented the wealth and lifestyle she believed she deserved. I sat there trying to process the scale of the deception when Daniel added the final detail that made the entire situation collapse into something almost absurd. "Michael, the guy she was talking about, he's the senior partner at her firm," he said quietly. "The same one who told everyone you were getting that promotion." Suddenly, the stranger in the lobby congratulating me made sense in the most twisted way possible. Lauren had been building a fantasy story about me becoming successful so she could elevate her own status at work, while secretly preparing to abandon me once she thought the money appeared. I left the bar that night with a strange mixture of emotions that shifted between anger, disbelief, and something that slowly turned into clarity. When I got home, Lauren was sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone like nothing in the world had changed, and she barely glanced up when I walked in. "You're late," she said casually, as if I had simply stayed out too long with friends. I stood there looking at the woman I had spent more than a decade of my life with and realized something quietly devastating. The person I thought I married didn't actually exist anymore. Or maybe she never had. I told her calmly that we needed to talk, and for the first time in weeks, she looked slightly uneasy. I explained that I knew about Daniel, the hotel, the lies she had been telling about our marriage, and the fantasy inheritance she thought she was going to take half of. At first, she tried to laugh it off. Then she tried to blame Daniel. Then she tried to accuse me of spying on her. But eventually the truth cornered her into silence. The final conversation between us lasted nearly 2 hours, and by the end of it, something in me had already moved past rage into acceptance. Lauren admitted that she believed my uncle's estate would make us rich, and that she had started planning a different life long before she ever filed for divorce. She admitted that she told Daniel lies about our relationship so she wouldn't feel guilty about crossing that line. And when I asked her directly whether she ever actually loved me or if I was just a stepping stone, she avoided the question entirely. That silence gave me the answer I needed. The next morning I called a lawyer and started the divorce process, not out of revenge, but out of the quiet understanding that some betrayals change the structure of a relationship so completely that there is no version of trust left to rebuild. What I learned from all of this is something I never expected to understand so painfully. Betrayal rarely appears suddenly. It grows slowly through small lies, quiet resentments, and choices people justify to themselves until they barely recognize what they've become. I'm still angry, still hurt, and some days the memories of those months feel like walking through broken glass. But there's also a strange clarity that came from the collapse of that illusion. If anyone reading this is in a situation where their instincts keep whispering that something isn't right, listen to those instincts before the truth forces itself into your life the way it did in mine. Because sometimes the person you trust most isn't just hiding an affair. Sometimes they are quietly rewriting your entire life without you even knowing it.